Yes.
Frank and I are honored today to offer some background context to the hidden figure that is Constance Baker Motley, the person, the lawyer, and the legacy. In 1973, Constance Baker Motley's mother, my grandmother, Rachel Huggins Baker, died at the age of 84. She died in New Haven, Connecticut. Shortly thereafter, a family committee formed, of which Judge Motley was a member. It formed with a vision to maintain and expand family connections. The committee was inspired by Rachel, or Aunt Miss as she was called, she had the unofficial title of welcoming new West Indians arriving in New Haven. Following a very successful first Huggins family reunion, which took place in New Haven in the summer of 1976. 3 years later, in the summer of 1979, over 100 family members, from little kids to senior citizens, gathered for a family reunion in Nevis in the British West Indies to visit the place we knew as the origin home. On this first trip, we discovered the land on which my grandmother had been born. Judge Motley secured the land, built a home on it, and spent winters there for many years, welcoming family, friends, and visiting judges. Here we see my mother on the porch of that home. And on the right, we see the family gathered at a reunion in 2017, visiting that home. Judge Motley's father, Willoughby Baker, arrived in New Haven, Connecticut in 1905, followed by Rachel Huggins in 1906. They came as immigrants from that Caribbean island of Nevis, and they were married in 1907 at St. Luke's Church. Constance Baker Motley was born in 1921. She was the ninth of 12 children. 3 children did not survive infancy. Here we see my grandfather and his brother soon after their arrival in the United States from Nevis. At any rate, Judge Motley grew up in an integrated and multicultural neighborhood with other West Indians, Jewish, Irish, Italian, and Polish families a few blocks beyond Yale's campus. Her father was a chef at Yale's famous Skull and Bones Secret Society, and other male relatives were employed at many of Yale's eating clubs and fraternities, including the Fence Club and the Quinnipiac Club, well into the 70s. In 1940, Judge Motley's life was transformed by Clarence Blakesley, a New Haven industrialist, philanthropist, and Yale alum. She had graduated from high school with honors the year before, was already a student leader and an excellent public speaker. Blakesley had been instrumental in establishing the Dixwell Community Center, better known as the Q House, for Black youth. He wanted to know why it wasn't being better used. Hearing Judge Motley's outspoken explanation, "You haven't asked the people who use the facility what they want," Blakesley was so impressed by the clearly intelligent young woman, he paid for her to go to college at Fisk and NYU and to law school at Columbia. Blakesley followed her rise and remained a mentor until his death in 1954. Judge Motley's good fortune continued when she obtained an internship during law school with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund under Thurgood Marshall's tutelage, and then a full-time job following. Despite Blakesley's efforts, no white shoe law firm in New York City would hire her. Her nearly 20-year career with the Legal Defense Fund was marked by some of the most significant desegregation wins in the history of the civil rights movement. An author of one of the draft Brown cases, she was also the lawyer in the University of Georgia case, which got Charlene Hunter Galt and Hamilton Holmes admitted, and where Vernon Jordan was her driver and carried her bags. But perhaps her most famous case was James Meredith's fight for admission to the University of Mississippi. Riots, killing, and Governor Ross Barnett. But victory was won. Listening recently to a speech former Legal Defense Fund Counsel Director Elaine Jones gave about Judge Motley some years ago, she quoted an interviewer's summary of Judge Motley's Legal Defense Fund caseload on one day in 1962. To quote, "Her current cases are spread across the spectrum of the civil rights legal struggle, but there is a concentration of school desegregation actions. Of 18 school desegregation cases, which she is personally conducting, 12 are countywide suits in Florida, 2 in Tennessee, 2 in Georgia, and 2 are in South Carolina. In other cases, she was representing Jackson, Mississippi residents seeking to enjoin state officials and police from enforcing laws requiring segregation in bus, railroad, and airline terminals. She's also directing a suit to desegregate the public parks and playgrounds of Tampa, Florida, and one to outlaw racial discrimination at the Tampa, Florida International Airport restaurant. That was her caseload on one day in 1962. She was a Black woman lawyer in the South who was subjected to untold abuse, disrespect, name-calling, and racial slurs. Her protectors were local members of the NAACP in whose homes she slept and who guarded her with rifles and guns. While all this litigation was going on, she had a husband and a son in New York City. And she was arguing cases before the Supreme Court of the United States. Belva Lockwood was the first woman to argue before the Supreme Court of the United States in 1879. Constance Baker Motley was the first Black woman to argue before the Supreme Court 82 years later. Between 1961 and 1965, Judge Motley argued 10 cases before the United States Supreme Court and won 9 of them. The case she lost, Swain v. Alabama, which held that the exclusion of Blacks from a petit jury, that is, the exclusion of Blacks from a petit jury, was not unconstitutional. Swain, however, was reversed 21 years later in Batson v. Kentucky. So effectively, she won 10 of the 10 cases she argued before the United States Supreme Court. That, my friends, is more than Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was 5 for 6. I'm just saying. I too love Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But here's what I'm saying. I'm just noting that there are those who say Judge Motley deserved a place on the United States Supreme Court. Nearly 20 years after spending years and untold abuse at the Legal Defense Fund's bidding for arguing cases and taking that abuse, it was time for her to move on. Judge Motley was elected to the New York State Senate in 1964, making her the first Black woman in the New York State Senate. And she then became the first woman, not first Black woman, the first woman borough president of Manhattan, a high-paying, high-profile public job. President Johnson appointed her as the first Black woman to the federal court in 1966. Southern senators, of course, fought her nomination, but she prevailed. She served as a judge until her death in 2005, nearly 40 years, and the jury assembly room in the Moynihan Federal Courthouse in Manhattan is named for her. In her 40 years, she had many important cases, as you can imagine. I'll mention just three. Sostra v. Rockefeller was a prisoner's rights case that set in motion restrictions on solitary confinement. Blank v. Sullivan and Cromwell, one of those white shoe type firms that would never have given her a job. A law firm tried to get her removed from a case which had alleged sexual discrimination in hiring on the grounds that she, Judge Motley, was a woman. They did not prevail. In Beinecke v. Kuhn, a case which argued that women reporters should not be allowed in professional men's locker rooms, she ruled that that was not to be the case, and she changed the course of professional sports reporting by saying that men and women had equal rights to report from the locker rooms of professional sports. Those are just three. There were many, many more. And of course, you can read all about that in your history books and the articles, and more recently in the biographies that have been written about her, most recently in Civil Rights Queen by Tamika Brown Nagin. Judge Motley's connections to New Haven and Connecticut remained strong throughout her life. She was always attentive to her family here. She encouraged and applauded educational achievements. And in the 1960s, she bought a 3-story home on University Place in New Haven for her mother and her 2 siblings, making sure, of course, that it was walking distance to St. Luke's Church. She also bought a house and property in Chester, Connecticut, as a weekend and summer home where she hosted family gatherings. That house is in the bottom of the screen right here. Thanks to efforts by the Chester Historical Society and the Chester Land Trust, that home, pictured here, is a private residence, but the property and both the home are on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. The Chester Land Trust also maintains the Constance Baker Motley Preserve and a beautiful public hiking trail called, appropriately, the Little Rock 9. The house at 8 Garden Street, also a private residence, likewise is on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. Nevis completes the circle again. The house and land Judge Motley secured fell into disrepair. following her death. But like a phoenix, it will have a new life as several cousins plan to restore it to continue the thread that, but for the immigration of Willoughby and Rachel, there would have been no Constance Baker Motley to celebrate or shoulders to stand on, as Vice President Kamala Harris and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and many, many others have acknowledged. Thank you. I now turn the microphone, at least, over to Frank, my colleague, and we're going to connect the dots at this point to the exhibit.
Thanks, Connie. That was great. Delighted to be here, and I'm actually in the Toni N and Wendell C Harp Historical Museum at the Dixwell Q House. Right behind me is an exhibition that opened this space a year or so ago, and it's sort of been condensed for the run of Timeless, this next show. We're looking forward to seeing people throughout the month of March, so definitely stay tuned for how you can come visit. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the opportunity that we have here with this exhibition. None of it would be possible without the prompt from the law school and the folks who helped to mount the exhibition last summer. And as importantly, Connie's stewardship of an incredible archive, a personal archive of material about the judge, but also about the family and about Dixwell and New Haven generally. And there are some really amazing pieces that really don't exist in too many other collections that will be on view, or the simulacra of these pieces will be on view for this exhibition. And I'm really excited about that. We are fortunate to have the support of the Vineyard Project for Black Futures in New Haven, a group of donors who are committed to telling important stories about Black New Haven and finding ways to change and impact conditions. So thinking about art and culture, but also thinking about daily life and putting their money into both of those areas, which is so critically important. So we don't have to choose between culture and beauty and celebration and everyday needs. And an exhibition that celebrates Constance Baker Motley and this family and all of its connections to other families around the city and the region and the country is the perfect first chapter in a series of stories about New Haveners and particularly folks in Dixwell and their lives and families. Because this family does exist in so many ways, and certainly the judge exists between culture and popular culture and celebration and critically important civil rights impact. And so it's a nice opportunity to recognize the donors and their support of these kinds of things in the community. And I'm going to just take a few minutes to go through some of the treasures that are going to be on loan and or reproduced thanks to Connie and her generosity and also her stewardship. I think the last time I was talking on this screen, we started talking about that great story in the Times about a young woman reporter who happened to find some stuff sitting outside her door that was destined for the trash heap. And in the boxes were these incredible photo albums of a Black family from the mid-20th century who had lived in New York and who had gone out to clubs. I mean, their daily lives were represented in these beautiful images. And this woman took it upon herself to track down the descendants of these people who had moved up to New York City from the South, and there was nobody left around. And she finally found a neighbor who knew somebody who had known them, and she tracked down, a great niece or something, and was able to return this material to these people. And this is one of those examples of actually having somebody who is willing to take care of and steward things that are dated from the 1930s and 20s. So thank you, Connie, because too often we lose things because nobody does that, but you've done this great service and this is a chance to celebrate it. So thanks for that. And there's some real treasures here of New Haven history that aren't in other collections. In this slide, you see our the logo for the series of exhibitions, Timeless, telling our neighborhood stories. And of course, every day we do write the book. So I want to make sure people got that. And this first iteration celebrates Constance Baker Motley. So in this grid, we've got, let me just kind of point to this wonderful series of images up there in the top corner, this women's lunch that Connie has the original of. It's a pretty, it's like 11 by 17 almost. It does need to have some TLC, but it's an incredible document of the kinds of things and sort of the ways that Black women mid-century were making a difference and combining celebration with political activism. I don't know if you want to say any more about this piece, Connie, because it is a beautiful piece.
The thing I will say about it is that the event, the women are beautiful and they are dressed to the nines. It was in New York, I believe at one of the big hotels. It was a celebration of my aunt, but the number of people from New Haven who went to this celebration is a testament to how New Haven supported Judge Motley and attended celebrations and lifted her up wherever they could and wherever she was. The same thing is true. I think you have a letter in here from the local NAACP, New Haven local NAACP, to her, you know, encouraging her in her studies, congratulating her on her work. And I just think that's community. And, you know, we often think New Haven doesn't, you know, support its own, but this community really did support her and supported her throughout her life. So yeah, it's a beautiful photograph.
It is, and it does need some TLC. So the folks on the call who actually have access to the kinds of tools for photo restoration, take note. And it is representative of a lot of photography that was generated in this community that still needs to be recovered and needs TLC. So a big project for all of us is to think about who do we know who took pictures in the 50s and 60s and 70s and may have them in their basements or garages that could be restored and going to someplace or be on exhibition. And the nice thing about this image too is that it really is a reminder of the importance of this network of Black women's clubs and men's clubs and the fraternal and sorority organizations and just how critical they were in the civil rights struggle and how important they were certainly in the Northeast. And this is a great example of that. Also on the screen is this February specials co-op store flyer. This sort of amazing series of kind of Samizdat-like publications that Connie has stewarded into the 21st century from the early 1930s that document neighborhood small businesses up and down Dixwell Avenue and all around this neighborhood and their efforts to market and to build a stronger network. Some of these documents link Plainville and New London and Hartford and Black businesses all around the state. They're coming out monthly and celebrating dances and parties and luncheons and all kinds of events, political events, students, small talks. There's a talk that a woman who graduated from Wellesley in the mid-30s is giving on one of these, and the talk is entitled Why I Chose a White College. So it's an incredible document that represents daily life in New Haven, and you know, it's not anyplace else. So Connie has rendered us this incredible service in holding on to these things, and they'll be available at some point for researchers and for folks to inspire people to look in their own attics and basements and see what they've got. Also, this great marketing piece for Elm Haven, and that's one that is held at the Yale Library, and it's it's really nice to have that as part of the story as well. So in this grid, trying to articulate some of the highlights from the exhibition. And just a shot here of kind of our working out of the title section, trying to do a couple new things. The idea of the show really is to get, it's a prompt for other people to think about what they might have and how they could tell their own stories, and trying to do that in new ways. So maybe not beginning with a full wall of intro title and intro panel text that people have to read, but having a guide, an audio guide who introduces the show. So when you come to the exhibition, you will hear Connie introduce her family and some of the highlights. And as she said, there were a lot of siblings. So she'll mention each one and give you a little sense of who they were, sort of, and how this network connected Judge Motley and sort of also maintained this incredible presence in New Haven. So this nice little montage of some of the highlights of her political career there. Want to add anything?
No, I think the only one that's missing here is her nomination to the federal bench, which we'll have to find and add. But this is a beautiful montage of her life, professional life.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think balancing the professional with the personal, you really want people, many folks know her professionally, and we wanted to add in sort of her connections to New Haven, her family connections, sort of the ways in which she cared about this city and this region, and the ways in which it always reappears throughout sort of the professional work and to her ascent as a public figure. It's another shot of the co-op store and this great piece on Elm Haven. And we want to wrap it up here. Hopefully you guys have got some questions for us. We could talk all day about this project, and I could certainly talk all day about what Connie has been holding on to that she's allowed us to share in this exhibition. Original first editions of Frida DeKnight's Date with the Dish, the Ebony magazine cookbook, a number of great stories about Judge Motley. She was heavily covered in Jet magazine and Ebony, and thank God you guys held on to those, because those things aren't in print anymore. Though there is a vibrant Ebony presence online. Instagram lives, Ebony lives on Instagram, that's for sure, and it's still making news and causing trouble. But the hard copy does not exist, and that's in some ways a tragedy. In the middle of the presentation, there was that great shot of, I think it would have been when she was an intern, and she's seated there, kind of, it was the shot left to right, but it was a skinnier shot, and she's like right in the corner. So you might have missed her unless you've got a really wide screen, but it's a really amazing picture of her as a very young person, kind of in company with all of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund luminaries. And in that spread from Ebony magazine, there's also a shot of W.E.B. Du Bois. Probably they're different offices, so it's not technically a connection, but it was really nice to think about them in the same conversation. So I'm going to stop there. Just to remind you, the Vineyard Project for Black Futures in New Haven, obviously supported by the Community Foundation here at the Dixwell Community House in the Toni N and Wendell C Harp Historical Museum.
Thank you so much to the great Constance Royster and Frank Mitchell. That was fantastic, and I'm so appreciative of the work you do to uplift such great and essential names like this. We have a couple, this is a time for everyone to begin putting questions in the chat. I just want to start it off by saying that the great thing about these Q House exhibitions is the constant history of community building and fellowship. And certainly Motley was a great advocate of that. For the people that are locals, but also to the people that are outsiders, if you will, visiting this exhibition, what are some of the main takeaways that you'd like them to grab from this? And either one, feel free to start.
Frank, do you want to start?
I was going to have you start. Sure. Certainly, I want people to think about the importance of the Q House and the fact that it continues to persist as an entity and as a resource. I want people to be inspired to look around in their own attics and their own basements and think about what they might have held on to. And so we are fortunate to have some real personal things, a Bible that is embossed to Constance Baker Motley, as I said, the cookbook, some things that are part of daily life that hopefully will inspire people to think about, what do they have? Do they have a yearbook? Do they have some family photos? What about their Bible? Have they checked Ancestry or the census, and what's out there that's going to help them tell their story, or at least some part of it? And I hope people will be inspired to do some of that. And the story of Constance Baker Motley is a really, really big swashbuckling story. So people will definitely, that won't be hard. And I think what's kind of fascinating is sort of the granular detail. I mean, the time she spends in Tennessee, the work she does at NYU as a student, her activism here in New Haven as a student, that she was going to youth conferences, really progressive youth conferences as a high schooler, and when she's preparing herself to go to college, as we are basically in the Depression, she's doing that work, and it's kind of incredible. And so I hope people are inspired by that and are inspired by the back and forth that she does between recognizing herself as a popular culture figure and also thinking about how important the importance of her political impact. And I think one little side note is, in the time, the big male civil rights figures have an aura and a persona, and they wear three-piece suits, and they are race men, and there's a real understanding of what that means. And it's fun to see her as she's documented in these pieces, because she does evolve into the same sort of race woman as an archetype in her style and what she presents herself as, and sort of that she is Mrs. Motley. And when she's in the South and she's being challenged, the fact that she can sort of pull herself up and she's sort of totally turned out and she really is this sort of formidable person in every way is exciting and impressive. And I hope people will see that in the images that we pull together and the kinds of things that Connie and her mother and everyone else has saved for us to be able to enjoy.
Constance?
I guess I will add, with respect to the Q House, the Q House has a history of its own that, has been reviewed and hopefully held on to from its, several demises and Phoenix risings. But it had a very important place in the life of Constance Baker Motley. I mean, if it hadn't been for the Q House, there would probably not be a Constance Baker Motley. It was her understanding of what the Q House meant to the community, and her opportunity to speak that truth to power to Clarence Blakesley, that afforded her the opportunity to get an education. And so the Q House had a place in the community from the very beginning, which in many ways she elevated. And that it's got a new life now is really important. There are lots of stories in the community of what the Q House meant to the community. And I think the community owes a lot of gratitude to her for making sure it had an early life, and now it has a phoenixed life. We had a family reunion this past summer, and there were some wonderful stories and bantering about the Q House. from cousins who were probably around 80 years old. And it would be great to capture some of those stories orally. I think there's an oral tradition that we need to claim again. And I also think that Judge Motley is one chapter. It's chapter one. And she's a very particular person to highlight. But I also want to say that everybody has a story. Every family that lived and lives in Dixwell has a story, which is, I think, what Frank is emphasizing as well. Don't throw out things. You know, tell the story of Dixwell through the families that have lived there and are living there now, and come to the exhibit and get ideas for what can be saved and what can be told, because everybody's got a story. Everybody.
Great. We have a bunch of questions here, so I'm going to be bouncing around a lot. Since we're on the Q House, quick question, I'm going to give you a two-parter. Why is it called the Q House? And then in terms of Motley's material, are there letters, diaries in her hand available, accessible?
I don't know the answer to the first question. But diaries is not a thing, was not a thing with her, but there are lots of writings and letters and things and signed documents. I just gave Frank for the exhibit her autobiography, which is signed, you know, signature. And again, her archive, her official archive, is at Smith College, which has a women's archive, big women's archive, and hers is just one piece of that archive. And the legal archive for her is at Columbia College, but most of the personal archive is at Smith College. What I still have has not gone there yet. But there's also family archive here in New Haven still. Her sister Edna Baker Carnegie, who many people know was a teacher in New Haven for 25 years or so, has an archive here in New Haven. And you know, my mother has an archive here. So the family, and again, all families, there are stories to tell. So yes, and I don't know the answer to why it was called the Q House.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that either. And certainly in the founding documents, it is the Dixwell Community House. And there was the community center in Waterbury was also called the Q House. So clearly there's a kind of a local, regional tag team thing happening here. And I'm sure there probably is an apocryphal story. I'm not gonna try and share it on something that's taped that'll live forever, because I don't want to be wrong for like the rest of my life. But yeah, it's a name that has the familiar resonance here in Connecticut, and certainly between New Haven and Waterbury and probably other places. The community center being known as the Q House is a thing, and certainly it's an early 20th century thing. And we should just note that as people are moving into these cities from other places to join the folks who had been here already, and they had been here, you know, since the colonial times, a number of entities, notably the Urban League, is doing research. And one of the realizations that it has is that people need recreational space. They need a Q House in Waterbury, and they need something in Hartford, and they need something in New Haven. And so we do see these places kind of pop up, and these sort of neighborhood entities in the 20s and 30s that become a focal point for Black communities around Connecticut as they're growing.
Fantastic. Another two-part question. I'm gonna probably continue doing two-part questions because we have a lot. Did she share any of her experiences with the community from her trials and travels to the South as a Black female litigator? And a second question is more for you, Constance. Could you tell us what it was like as a family member? How did she juggle it all? They recall reading from Pauli Murray at the NAACP. Were they there at the same time? And Pauli Murray also talks about working on the early civil rights cases with Thurgood Marshall. Hope to get some insight on that, but feel free to answer both those questions as you will.
Okay, so she did know Pauli Murray, I don't know whether they overlapped. There may be more about that in Civil Rights Queen, the book that I mentioned, but I do know that she did know her. In terms of talking about her work to us family members, she was not given to like small talk or talk about, what's going on with her cases. I mean, when she came home, and I mean by coming home to New Haven, she came home to be a daughter, and an aunt, and to relax, right? I mean, she wanted to be a human being too. So, people who tried to ask her questions about her cases and stuff, she would really say, I don't want to talk about that. I mean, she's home. And like any other normal human being, she wants to rest. You heard the recitation of what her docket looked like. And she's, flying back and forth. And when she's coming home to New York, she wants to be with her family. So, I mean, I remember seeing her on TV, at news reports, but really, that wasn't her style. It just wasn't her style.
Follow up. This is more on the Q House, and this is a really great question. Do you see the Q House exhibit of storytelling and narrative sharing as a model for other communities? How do you perceive its inspirational quality or hope for its importance, encouraging others to reclaim their stories? Big question.
Yes,
really good.
yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah, whoever that is, contact us. We want you to help. We do actually, and I think part of why the foundation and the Vineyard Project wanted to support this was that they really do want this to inspire or prompt or encourage other residents here, but also they want this to be something that can be shared around the region. So we can have this larger conversation with people about what's been left behind. I think what's kind of fascinating about all of this is when people had cameras and they printed photographs, and what's exciting about this archive is that there is all of this kind of everyday family hangout stuff represented. And so there's Judge Motley on the riding mower in some backyard in overalls. And so you so much character of daily life comes out in these images. And in many ways, we don't have as much of that in our daily lives now. We have it on our digital phones, but we don't have it in albums that we can share and that people can look forward to receiving in 100 years or 50 years or whatever. And the hope is that there is some of that out there for people who were around in the 70s, because at that point, the stories that we knew about neighborhoods were often the stories that the Register told us or the New York Times tells us. And so what we do hope in sharing these images and talking about somewhat private aspects or family aspects of a big public person is that it reminds people that they can do this too. And we are thinking a lot about chapter 2, chapter 3, and how do we translate this exhibition into something that go to a library in North Haven or Glastonbury or other places and remind people of what New Haven has and what Hartford has and what all the cities around Connecticut could have. and encourage them to do that. But whoever asked this question, yeah, we would love to have your help on this. So if you got ideas, I don't know, put them in the chat or email the Beinecke and they'll send them to us. So thanks.
And I'd also like to add that part of this is also to tell the story of Constance Baker Motley, whose legacy is not well known. Her place in history is certainly established, but her place, her legacy as a person who was so important to the civil rights movement and even to New Haven is just not well known. So we like also to be able to tell this story in schools, you know, and to encourage young people to know not only about, you know, who she is in the history of the United States, but also to appreciate who they are and that they're part of, you know, whatever the family is, they're part of the community. They too have a story to hold on to and to tell. So we'd like to expand this to the educational system somehow. We want to get in those schools.
Absolutely. I mean, at the Beinecke and all these wonderful special collection institutions that live in New Haven and Connecticut, we stress that all the time. Primary sources matter and make it real. We're going to end on one last question. Before we do, just a reminder to everybody, Mondays at Beinecke is a weekly thing. Next week, we'll be having a talk on our current building-wide exhibition, which is Revisiting the Past, Imagining the Future, with Michael Meng, librarian for Chinese Studies. And this current recording will be available on our YouTube channel within a week. So feel free to check back into the Beinecke's YouTube channel. This is a good question. I actually had a similar question. Thank you for this inspiring presentation, thinking about the comments around convening and the importance of gathering and the support it provided in historical time. Are there lessons learned for the present that you might offer based on your look at this material? And I also had just a more general question that goes with that. How has her existence and the monumental work that she's done affected you and your daily lives and the work that you go about every day? Another big question.
Okay, so I think, yeah, there are definitely lessons. And the one lesson is that you have to keep fighting. I mean, some of the things that she fought for are coming back, right? I mean, the fight continues. And you could be pretty disheartened and disappointed, distressed and depressed by what we see looking around the world today, particularly the United States, in terms of civil rights. I mean, the hard-fought battles. But I know that I would take from the lessons learned from her that you could be pretty disappointed, but you can't give up. And you have to just keep fighting. And when I look at some of the materials that even I'm looking at, having dug through more boxes than any human should have in their house, I am seeing evidence of that as I go through some of these materials, that, you know, you just have to keep going. And I read and see plaques and honors, and I see photographs, etc. That it was a long fought battle that we have an obligation to keep fighting for. Yeah, it is monumental work, but it's it's worth fighting for.
Yeah. And I guess I would just add, it's a really complicated time for public humanities and for African-American studies generally, certainly in Florida and other places, and how the histories that we share and care about. So holding on to things so that we have evidence and being willing to wrestle with how we tell the stories is critical. And some of that's the work of institutions, but a lot of it really does have to be the work of individuals, that people have to say, it's important that somebody knows this, and I'm going to keep these things, and I'm going to keep perfecting how I tell the story of this one little episode so that it's my personal story, but it also suggests I understand the ways it impacts the community and the region and everybody else, because that's how we will be able to document these histories and lead to something like a monument or some memorial or some larger sense of this is what we know about New Haven in the early 21st century, or Connecticut and Black and other communities, and what people were doing at that time. So yeah, it shouldn't feel as critical as it does, but it is. And being able to look through the archives that Connie has amassed and held on to is sort of a great reminder that, we got to hold this stuff and we've got to think about how we talk about it, because it can be saving our lives.
That's a good way to put it. It could be saving our lives. Documentation matters, and history certainly matters as well. Everyone is welcome to see this exhibition on Dixwell, opening on Saturday, March 4th. Frank Mitchell, Constance Royster, thank you so much for your time and providing such great work for the community to immerse with. And anyone who has questions, feel free to reach out to the Beinecke and we'll forward it over to them. With that being said, thank you for joining us for another Mondays at Beinecke, and we will see you next week.
Thank you.